The Little Death, a Henry Rios mystery. Author Michael Nava. Publisher Allison Press. Narrator Eric Aust. Written 1986. I wish to thank Paul Gillette, without whom I would not have finished this book, and the Wednesday night regulars. In Vino Veritas. Chapter 1. I stood in the sally port while the steel door rolled back with a clang, and then I stepped through into the jail. A sign on the wall ordered the prisoners to proceed no further. More to the point, the word "stop" was scrawled beneath the printed message. I stopped and looked up at the mirror above the sign, where I saw a slender, dark-haired man in a wrinkled seersucker suit. Myself, as I adjusted the knot in my tie. A television camera recorded the gesture on a screen in the booking room. It was 6:30 in the morning, but the jail was as loud as if it had been 6:30 at night. The jail was built in the basement of the courthouse, and there were, of course, no windows. Only the intense white fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. The jail was a place where people waited out their time, and yet without day or night time stood still. Only meal times and the change of guards communicated the passage of time to the inmates. I moved out of the way of a trustee who raced by carrying trays of food. Breakfast that morning, the last day of July, was oatmeal, canned fruit cocktail, toast, milk, and Senka. Jones stepped into the hall from the kitchen and acknowledged me with an abrupt nod. He had done his hair up in cornrows, and his apron was splattered with oatmeal. Jones cooked for the population. He was also a burglar and an informant, and his one great fear was coming to trial and being sentenced to time at the state prison in Folsom. Several of his ex-associates were there. Thanks to his help, I had just been granted a further continuance of his trial, delaying it for another 60 days. Our strategy was to string out his case as long as possible, so that when he inevitably pled guilty, he would be credited with the time he served in county jail and avoid Folsom altogether. The district attorney's office was cooperative. The least they owed him was county time. Easy time, the prisoners called it. County was relatively uncrowded, and the sheriff's relatively benign. On the other hand, county stank, like every other jail I'd ever been in. The stink was a complex odor of ammonia, unwashed bodies, latrines, dirty linen, and cigarette smoke, compounded by bad ventilation and mingled with a sexual musk, a distinctive genital smell. The walls were faded green, grimy, and scuffed. The floor, oddly enough, was spotless. The trustees mopped it at all hours of the day and night. Busy work, I suppose. Everyone in the public defender's office avoided the jail rotation. If the law was a temple, it was built on human misery, and jails were the cornerstones. I minded the jail less than most, finding it, psychologically at least, not so much different from a courtroom. So much of crime and punishment consisted of merely waiting for something to happen, for a case to move. But it was different. The jail from the plush law school classroom, just a few miles away from which I graduated 10 years earlier, determined to do good, to be good. I achieved at least one of those things. I was a good lawyer, and most days that was enough. I was aware, however, that I took refuge in my profession, as unlikely as that seemed considering the amount of human suffering I dealt with. It offered me a role to escape into from what I no longer knew. Perhaps nothing more significant than my own little ration of suffering. I went into my office, a small room tucked away at the end of a corridor, and where it was almost impossible to hear yourself think. I picked up a sheaf of papers, arrest reports, and booking sheets. The night's haul. There was the usual array of vagrants and drunk drivers, a couple of burglaries, a trespass. One burglary, involving 2 men, was the most serious of the cases, so I gave it special attention. The two suspects were seen breaking into a car in the parking lot of a Mexican restaurant on El Camino. The police recovered a chunk full of car stereos, wires still attached. The suspects were black men in their early 20s with just enough by way of rap sheets to appeal to a judge's hanging instinct. I gathered the papers together and went into the booking office. "Good morning, Henry," Novak drawled, looking up from the sports page. He had a pale, pudgy face and a wispy little mustache above a mouth set in a perpetual smirk. Novak treated me with the same lazy contempt with which he treated all civilians, not holding the fact that I was a lawyer against me. This made us friends, of a sort. "Good morning, Deputy," I replied. "We had ourselves a little bit of excitement here last night," he said, folding his paper. "Los Altos brought in a drunk. That's what they thought he was, anyway. And it took 3 of us to subdue him." "What was he on?" "Well, we took a couple of sherms off of him when we finally got him stripped and housed. So it was probably PCP. Why didn't I see an arrest report for him?" "We couldn't book him until he came down enough to talk. Here's his papers." I took the papers and asked, "Where is he now?" "In the drunk tank with the queens. He's a fag." "That's no crime," I reminded him. "Good thing, too, and we'd have to charge admission around here." I read the report. The suspect's name was Hugh Paris. He stood 5'10", had blonde hair and blue eyes. He refused to give an address or answer questions about his employment or his family. He had no criminal record. I studied his booking photo. His hair was in his face, and his eyes went off in 2 different directions. But there was no denying he was an exceptionally handsome man. "How do you know he's gay?" I asked. "I picked him up outside of that fag bar in Cupertino," Novak said. "He was arrested for being under the influence of PCP, possession of PCP, resisting arrest, and battery on an officer." Jeez. Did the arresting officer go through the penal code at random? Novak scowled at me. "Was anybody hurt?" "Just scuff marks, counsel." "Was he examined by a doctor to determine whether he was under the influence?" "No." "Did you ask him to submit to a urine test?" "No." "Then all you can really prove against him is drug possession." "Well," Novak said, "I guess that's a matter of interpretation between you and the DA. Are you going to want to see the guy?" "I'll talk to him," I replied. "But first, I want to interview with these two." And I read him the names of the burglars. I interviewed the burglary suspects separately. They were bored, but cooperative. They knew the system as well as I did. They had nothing by way of defense, so the best I could do for them was try to plead them to something less serious than burglary. I'd observed that repeat offenders were the easiest to deal with, treating their lawyers with something akin to professional courtesy. All they wanted was a deal. It was only the first-timers who bothered to tell you they were innocent. After the interviews ended, I walked back to the booking office and poured myself a cup of Novak's coffee. I flipped him a quarter and asked to see Hugh Paris. They brought him in handcuffs and a pair of jail blues so big that they fell from his shoulders and nearly covered his bare feet. His eyes were focused, but he still looked disheveled. I thought, irrelevantly, of a picture of a saint I had seen as a boy, as he was being led off to his martyrdom. There was a glint of purity in Hugh Paris's eyes, completely at odds with everything that was happening around him. The guard set him down in the chair across from mine. I took out a legal pad and set it down on the table between us. I introduced myself as Henry Rios, from the Public Defender's Office. "A lawyer?" he asked thickly. "That's right," I said. "How do you feel, Mr. Paris?" He gave me a puzzled look, as if how he felt should be obvious, and asked, "Are the handcuffs necessary?" "The sheriff thinks so," I said, studying him. Do you think you'd do all right without them? I'm not going to hurt you. I had decided he was down from whatever drug he had taken. I called in the deputy and asked him to remove the handcuffs. He resisted, but in the end the handcuffs went. He stationed himself outside the door. I got up and closed it. Better? I asked. Paris smiled, revealing a set of even white teeth. He rubbed his wrist and smoothed his hair, buttoned the top buttons of the jail jumpsuit, and pulled himself up in the chair. He looked less dazed now, and he fixed me with a look of appraisal. Thank you, he said. I feel terrible. Why am I here? You were arrested, I replied, and read him the charges. Mr. Rios, he said, I don't remember much about last night, but I do know that I didn't take any drugs. None? I smoked a joint, then I went to this bar. What's the last thing you remember? I was having a drink, he said, and then I heard this horrible rasping noise. It scared the hell out of me, and then I realized it was my own breathing. Then I went outside. I think, because I remember the lights, and then I woke up here. That's it. The police found a couple of sherms in your clothes, I said, testing him. What's a sherm? He asked. Cigarettes, dipped into PCP. I don't smoke, he replied conversationally. It was possible he was telling the truth. Were you alone at the bar? I came with an ex-boyfriend, he said calmly. But he left before any of this happened. You smoked the joint with him? Yes. Did you know anyone else at the bar? Not that I remember. How many drinks did you have? Two or three. Not more than three. What's your friend's name? I don't want him involved. I had been taking notes. I put down my pen and leaned back into the chair. There isn't anyone in this room but you and me, I began. Anything you say to me is privileged. The resisting and battery charges won't stick, and they have no evidence you were under the influence of PCP because they didn't bother to have you examined by a doctor. That just leaves the possession charge. If you were just holding it for someone, I might get the charge reduced or even dismissed. You don't believe me, he said. I have to argue evidence, I said, and the evidence is, first, you were high on something last night, and second, the police found PCP on you. It shouldn't be hard to see what inference can be drawn from those two facts. I know what PCP is, he said, but I've never used it, and I've certainly never carried it on me. It could have been in the joint you smoked with your friend, I said. Let me at least talk to him. He shook his head. I have to take care of this my own way. You have money to hire your own lawyer? Money isn't the problem, he said, dismissing the thought with a shrug. He looked away from me and seemed to withdraw into himself. I could hear the deputy outside the door shouting at a trustee. Paris looked back at me without expression. The silence went on for a second too long. You're gay, he said. Still looking into his eyes, I said, Yes, I am. I didn't think so at first. What gave me away? You didn't react at all when I mentioned my boyfriend. You didn't even blink. Straight men always give themselves away. I shrugged. There probably isn't anything you could tell me about yourself or your boyfriend that would surprise me, so why not level with me about last night? I have, he said wearily. Look, it was Paul's joint, and maybe it was laced with PCP. He could have given me the cigarettes. I just don't remember. Then let's call him and clear it up. I can't. Why? I'm hiding, he said. I shouldn't have called Paul in the first place. I can't risk seeing him again. Who are you hiding from? I'm sorry, he said. I can't tell you. Although I'd like to. Then take my card, I said, digging one out from the wallet, and call me when you want to talk. He studied the card and said, Thanks. I'd like to make a phone call. I'll take care of that, I said. I reached across the table to shake his hand. This we did very formally. Then the deputy knocked, and I called him in to take the prisoner back to his cell. Outside, it was bright and balmy morning. A fresh, warm wind lifted the tops of the palm trees that lined the streets, and sunlight glittered on the pavement. I put on my sunglasses and headed toward California Avenue, where I was meeting my best friend, Aaron Gold, for breakfast. He had told me he had a business proposition to make. A couple of kids cycled by with day packs strapped to their shoulders. The Southern Pacific commuter, bound for San Francisco, rumbled by at the end of the street. I felt a flash of restlessness as it passed. Another summer passing in 2 months, I would be 34. Henry, I heard Gold call. I looked from where I'd stopped, in front of a pet store. He approached rapidly, his intelligent simian face balled into a squint against the sunlight. He was tall, pale, a little thick around the waist, but he still carried himself like the college jock he'd been. "Morning, Aaron." "What were you thinking about?" he asked. "Nothing, really. Getting older." He made a derisive little noise. "You're still a kid. Look at me. I'm pushing 40. Am I worried?" "You're in your prime," I said, not altogether jokingly. In his tailored suit, Gold looked sleek and prosperous, from his polished shoes and manicured nails to the $50 haircut that tamed his curly black hair. "You never went to my tailor," he said, looking me over critically. "Come on, let's eat." He took me by the elbow and led me across the street into the restaurant where all the waitresses knew him by name. We found a table at the back, ordered breakfast, and drank our first cups of coffee in silence. 13 years earlier, Gold and I had been assigned as roommates in the law school dormitory, our first year there. We had not liked each other much at first. He mistook my shyness for arrogance, and I failed to see that his arrogance masked his shyness. Things sorted themselves out, and we became friends. He was one of the first people I told I was gay. It would be an exaggeration to say he took it well. But we remained friends on the levels that counted most: respect and trust. Lately, he had even relaxed a little bit about my homosexuality, joking that I needed to meet a nice Jewish boy and settle down. He was saying, "Did you run into anyone I know at the jail?" "You don't go to county jail for SEC violations," I replied. "Trading stock on insider information isn't the only criminal activity my clients engage in." Doubtless, but they wouldn't stoop to the services of a public defender. "Actually," he said, "that brings me to the subject of this meeting, your future. It's secure as long as there's crime in the streets." "Well, there's crime in the boardrooms, too." "Henry, my firm is interested in hiring an associate with a criminal law background. I've circulated your name. People are impressed." "Why would your firm dirty its hands in criminal practice?" Gold put his coffee cup down and said, "Corporations consist of people, some of whom are remarkably venal. Others still are just plain stupid. Anyway, they've come to us often enough needing a criminal defense lawyer to make it worth our while to hire one. We'd start you as a third-year associate at $60,000 a year." I answered quickly, "Well, thanks for thinking of me, but I'm not interested." Gold said, "Look, if it's the money, I know you deserve more, but that's just starting pay." "You know it's not the money, Aaron," I said, reflecting that the sum he named was almost double my present wage. He sighed and said, "Henry, don't tell me it's the principal." I said nothing. "You're wasting yourself in the public defender's office. You knock yourself out for some little creep, and what you get in return is a shoebox of an office and less money than a first-year associate at my firm makes. So, I should exchange it for a bigger office and more money and the opportunity to defend some rising young executive who gets busted for drunk driving." "Why not? Aren't the rich entitled to as decent a defense as the poor?" "You never hear much public outcry over the quality of legal representation of the rich." "What is it you want?" he asked, his voice rising. "The rosy, warm glow that comes from doing good. You're not dealing with political prisoners. You're dealing with crooks and murderers. It's true they don't recruit criminals from country clubs, but if they're outsiders, so am I. Because you're gay, he said flatly, dropping his voice. If you're gay. That's settled. I won't argue the point now, he said, but you let it run your life, closing doors for you. If you really were gay and accepted it, you would make your choices on other grounds than whether someone would object. I can think of plenty of reasons for not joining your firm, I replied. None of them related to being gay. They aren't why you'll turn me down, he said. I laid my fork aside and glanced out the window. It was luminous with summer light. Gold and I had a variation of this conversation nearly every time we talked. Since each of our positions was set in stone, the only thing our talking accomplished was to get us angry at each other. Every choice closes doors, I said, and at some point you are left in the little room of yourself. I think most people who get to that room go crazy because they're surrounded with missed possibilities and no principle to explain or justify why they made the choices they did. I don't invite unhappiness. Aaron, avoiding conflict may not be the noblest principle, but it works for me. Can you say you're happy? No. Can you? No, but there are substitutes. I didn't need to ask him what his substitutes were. I knew work was at the top of the list. In fact, work was the whole of his list. It had been mine, too, but recently I'd lost a big case, and word had it I was burned out. Maybe I was, but if so, what was my alternative to work? I had never thought to cultivate any. The waitress came around, and I offered her my cup for coffee, promising myself I would sit down later and think about the future, hoping it would creep up on me before I had the chance. I told Aaron about my jailhouse interviews. Hugh Paris, Gold said. That name is familiar. Think he trades stock on insider information? Maybe he's rich. I shook my head. You'd be surprised, Gold continued. At the number of the rich in our little town, they may not control their money or know exactly where it comes from, but it dribbles in from trusts, stocks, annuities. Whether or not he was rich, I said. I wish he'd talk to me. He looked like he was carrying a secret he needed badly to unload. Another missed possibility? Gold asked as he reached for the check. I let him take it. It was a little after 8 when I got to my office on the 4th floor of the courtroom. There were already people waiting in the reception room, thumbing through the inevitable packets of official-looking papers that criminal defendants seem to generate as they go through the system. The receptionist had not yet come in, so they stopped me as I walked through, and I tried to answer their questions. Finally, I made it to the door that separated us from our clients. I walked down the narrow corridor, made narrower by the presence of file cabinets, for which there was no other space. Pushed against the walls, I passed my small, sunless office and headed toward the lounge. Frances Kelly, the supervising attorney, sat at a table with the Daily Legal Journal spread out in front of her. She lit a cigarette, burned between her fingers, lifting it to her lips just as the ash fell, dropping on the lapel of her jacket. She looked up at me as I poured myself some coffee. Did you know Roger Shaney? She asked. Not well, I answered. He left the office just as I was coming in. Excellent lawyer, she said. He and I trained together, shared an office. He helped me prepare for my first trial. Is there something about him in the journal? I asked, sitting across from her as she lit another cigarette. He's being arraigned today in federal court in San Francisco, she said, on a conspiracy to distribute cocaine charge. Roger Shaney? I asked, incredulously. I thought you were going to tell me he'd been elevated to the bench. With Roger, she replied. It could have gone either way. Are the charges true, then? I know he had a very successful practice defending some big dealers, and he was making a lot of money. But that was never the lure of the law for him. No, then what? She rose heavily, an elegant fat woman in a linen suit with black hair and beautiful clear eyes, and ambled to the coffee urn. He was an intellectual virtuoso, she said, convinced he could talk circles around any other lawyer or judge. And he was right, but the courtroom isn't the real world. He thought he could get away with something. We must presume him innocent, she said, piously. But he had that kind of vanity. After a second, she added, so do you. She headed for the door and motioned for me to follow. We went into her office, the only one with a window. Outside, a thin layer of smog rose in the direction of San Jose, but the view to the brown hills surrounding the university was clear as they rolled beyond the palm trees and red tile roofs. Francis was saying, I sometimes think really brilliant people shouldn't be permitted to practice law. They get bored too easily and cause trouble. Are you about to pass along some advice? She laughed. I just want to know how you are. Henry, you've been with us 3 months, and we haven't had much chance to talk. She referred to my forced transfer from the main office to San Jose to this branch office. The topic of conversation, my mental health, now came into focus as sharply as the yellow rose in the vase at the edge of Francis's desk. I was annoyed by both. Considering that my transfer was against my will, I'm fine. I had nothing to do with the transfer, she said. You're not being put out to pasture, just given a rest after your last trial. Which I lost, I said. That was the real reason I got kicked down from felony trials to arraignments. The jury convicted him, she said, and no one faults your work, which, considering the circumstances, was excellent. I didn't know whether by circumstances she referred to the fact that only a few IQ points separated my client from a vegetable, or the fact that he used an axe handle to bludgeon his elderly parents to death. A series of coroner's photographs passed through my mind. Pained by the recollection, I touched my fingers to my forehead. She got the gesture and tactfully looked away. The circumstances were of no interest to the jury, I said. They sent him to death row. That's an appeal. And I was farmed out here to rusticate. You object to my company. She expelled a gust of cigarette smoke that passed through the sunlight like a cloud. But seriously, I replied. To rest, she said, from the pasture of trial court. I could see the burnout on your face when you first got here. Send me back, I said. I've done nothing but interview clients for other lawyers and sit in arraignment court haggling with the DA over public nuisance cases. Whether you go back is not my call. Whether? I demanded. Not when. Call San Jose and tell them that I didn't crack up, after all. Tell them I'm burned out from the other end. I mean, you all think I'm demoralized or exhausted from my work, but I'm not. It's the rest of my life I'm burned out on. This job keeps me going. I heard the tremor in my voice, so I cut myself short. I'm not proposing to take your job away, she replied. Everyone in the office knows you're one of the best lawyers we have. She put out her cigarette in an onyx ashtray and lit another. The office has just hired a dozen new lawyers, most fresh out of law school. They're looking for someone to train them. The job is yours if you want it. That's the second best offer I've had this morning, I said. She looked puzzled. It's nothing. I don't see myself as a teacher. You have so much to pass along. I'm 33, Francis, not 63. I'm not ready to sit on the veranda and tell war stories. Think about it, she said. She noticed me looking at the rose, and she plucked it from the vase and handed it to me. And if I don't take the job, my exile continues. The rose is from my garden, she replied. My favorite flower, I said, standing. In my office, I dropped the rose into the trash can and sat down. There was a pile of cases to be reviewed before I went down to arraignments court that afternoon. There was also a list of clients to be interviewed and advised, and cases to be assigned to other lawyers. I opened the first file and thought immediately of Hugh Paris, sitting in his cell downstairs, and here, I told myself, I sit in my cell upstairs. I dismissed the thought as self-pity, compounded with a pang of lust. But the little room was too warm, suddenly, and I could not concentrate on the papers before me. I got up and went into the bathroom, where I washed my face in cold water. Looking at the mirror, I studied that face carefully. I pressed my fingers lightly at the corners of my eyes, smoothing out the wrinkles, and I looked. Almost 25 again. I could quit and start over. I told the reflection in the mirror. My eyes answered, Start what over? What is there? Another lawyer came in, and I turned from the mirror, said hello to him, and went back to my office. The morning dragged on as I shuffled files from one side of my desk to the other. Outside my office, I heard the babble of voices as the other lawyers interviewed clients and witnesses or hurried off to court, shouting last-minute questions about a legal issue or a particular judge's temperament. I felt the excitement, but did not share it. There comes a point in the career of every criminal defense lawyer when he realizes that what keeps him in practice are his prejudices, not his principles. Suspicion of authority and contempt for the platitudes with which injustice too often cloaks itself can take you a long way, but ultimately they are no substitute for the simple faith that what you are doing is right. It came to me as I sat there buried in papers that I had lost that faith. I left a message with Frances' secretary that I wanted to see her after lunch, then went off to a nearby bar and had a couple of drinks. As I sat in the bar stool, cracking peanuts and sipping my bourbon, my thoughts veered back to Hugh Paris. It was nothing as trivial as lust. Seeing him had precipitated this crisis because I had not been able to help him, though I wanted to. And after all, what did my help account to? Getting someone less time in jail than otherwise, or even getting him off for often temporary respites and long-term downward slides. That was the extent of the assistance I could offer, dispensing placebos to the terminally ill. Frances was in her office when I knocked at the door. She beckoned me in and sat down, swallowed the mint I'd been chewing to mask the bourbon on my breath. It was important that she not know I had been drinking. "Frances, I've made a decision. You'll teach the class." "No." I gripped my hands together in my lap. "I'm quitting." "What?" She stared at me. "I called San Jose and told them I wanted to tell you, too. I wanted to thank you for your many kindnesses." I stopped. The air between us buzzed with inarticulate feeling. "Henry, you can't mean this. Take a few days off. A few weeks if you want. Travel." I shook my head. "I hate traveling. I have no hobbies. I'm 33 years old, and all I know about life is what I learned in law school or the inside of a courtroom. And it's pathetically little. Frances," she reached for a cigarette, "I know I'm a little old for it, but I think I'm having an identity crisis." "That's no reason to quit your job," she replied. "This is more than my job. It's my life. And it's not enough." I rose. "Do you understand?" "No. Do you?" "Not very clearly." I sat down again. "I met a man in the jail this morning, an inmate. I wanted to help him, to offer him some kind of comfort, something human. But all I knew how to do was deliver speeches." "We offer people what no one else can give them," Frances said, "a possible way out of their trouble. Is that so insignificant?" "Of course not, when it works, but so often it doesn't. And anyway," I laid my hands on her desk, "what does that give me?" She sighed. "Well, that's the key, isn't it? If you've reached the point of asking that question, then whatever you're getting from it is obviously not enough." "Wish me luck." "No," she said. "I wish you'll change your mind." "I won't." "All right," she said. "Then good luck." I went back to my office and cleared out my desk. Some of the other lawyers drifted in, stood around nervously, said a few well-intended words, but by 3 o'clock, I'd done nearly everything I needed to do to extricate myself from my job. Just before I left, I called down to the jail. Hugh Paris had been bailed out by someone who signed the bail receipt as John Smith. I gathered up the last of my papers and left. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.